All right. I guess we'll be starting. So it's interesting how I guess most of the developers today will be gathered talking about 5.5 and what it brings to the table in terms of megalights and all the shiny new toys, as does Unreal with every release, right? And I'm sure some of you must have also caught on with real-time path tracing and NVIDIA's fork of Unreal. If you haven't, go check it out. It's crazy. I'm sure some of the games have already been using it at this point, but it's engine available right now. And to the contrary, I will be talking about so-called bygone techniques, which is not really what it is. My topic is lighting for limited hardware, not to say specifically for mobile as such, could be for extrapolated for your medium-grade CPU to anywhere below that, which does not hold anything against current-gen flagship GPU integrated hardware. So that's the topic for the day. A little bit about myself. I'm an Unreal Authorized instructor. That was what I used to do primarily. Right now, I work with different companies as an external contractor leading their Unreal team to their clients and use case with Unreal, whether it be Final Pixel use case or anything interactive, PC-wise or VR-wise. So these are some of the work. On top, you see our work with Chandrayaan-2 with ISRO, a Ford Bronco project. These are direct samples from Unreal. This is obviously from the engine screenshot. Some of the other projects include NCPO, which stands for National Center for Polar and Ocean Research. That's a division of the Ministry of Earth and Sciences, India. Another project with Bud Light. That, by the way, is an entire crowd simulation of about 2,300 people live in an arena, each with unique animation and some miscellaneous stuff other than that. And working with clients which are not directly asking for a game development outcome with Unreal brings into perspective how vast the use case is with an engine like this, wherein you can start all the way from needing very crisp, to the pixel, very high quality output, as you are aware of if you see any reel on YouTube with Unreal Engine, all the way down to something which is still utilizing techniques, lighting techniques, which is what I'm going to be covering. And this harkens back to people asking me a lot, like I've come across people who have trained, Rajdeep, how do you, we are building a configurator or an HMI solution where we cannot leverage Lumen, at least because this is lighting related. So Lumen or any of the integratable GI solutions that comes with the engine, either external or internal, how do we get about getting good lighting? The obvious answer does come with what we know we used to always do with 4.27 or earlier. Because if you look at people who have ventured into this industry, and they're starting with 5.0, or at this point 5.5, right, or 5.4 as production ready, they'll get Lumen out of the box, or any other integratable GI solution, ambient occlusion solution, which is very close to ground truth output if you compare it to path tracing. But if the same sort of people need an output which is as similar or close to photorealism without being able to leverage these solutions, what do you do for them? And these people always have to understand that when we were using 4.whatever X without Lumen out of the box, the engine right away did not give us anything that's so pretty looking that you see nowadays, right? So this is the agenda for today. I'll be talking about pre-computed lighting. Some of these things I'm sure you've heard of, used. Your seasoned developer over here or your lighting department will be very accustomed to all of these. You must be wondering, why do I bring these up if they are so common? The thing is, actually, it may be common for you, but a newcomer developer who's using the engine with features such as Lumen nowadays, or any other solution similar to that, will not be accustomed to working in an environment where you have to iteratively get to the photorealism using techniques like these. These also include tricks which aren't, I would say, are out-of-the-box solution in the engine. So I'll be covering some of those as well, where you have to sort of leverage techniques which may be outside, and some of these techniques have also been integrated in the engine. So we'll look at that. And let's start off with pre-computed lighting, or what we know as light baking. So we have two examples, as you see. Now, one of them is Lumen. I'm not going to be taking a poll here or anything, but if you had to take a guess, which one do you think is Lumen? I can already hear your mind saying, well, this is a best-case scenario, right? These are all static. It's an interior environment with static actors or whatever you call it. We'll come to the movable side of things, right? So, but still, if you had to take a guess, again, I won't be taking a poll, but if you guessed Lumen on top, that's right. And the bottom is a pre-computed lighting scenario. This actually is funny how it goes to say so much about Lumen and how far it has come. Because if you think about light baking, it's close to ground truth as pre-computed lighting can get, right? Because it is what it is. Even if you compare it to path tracing, it's very close to reality, right? As you can get in a game engine. That's just talking in favor of Lumen, but there are certain areas where GPU light baking or any kind of light baking takes over, where even if you have some considerations to make, you will have better outcomes, like pristine and very clean reflections, very sharp contact shadows. But again, I hear you wondering, like, what about a moving scenario? What about that? Because this is a perfect use case, right? So we'll get into that. I'll talk a little bit about the two options that you get light baking-wise. CPU light mask and GPU light mask. These two are now ready, integrated into the engine. It's been since 4.26, I guess. Wasn't the case always, but if I had to make a differentiation, I would go with CPU if I had a very large scene to deal with, unless I had any other solution which would allow me to use GPU light mask for multiple sub-level scenario, right? CPU light mask does very well with large scenarios. GPU light mask does well in another category, which is keeping parity with secondary, tertiary bounces, which you do not get with CPU light mask. And that's where we'll get into the engine. My presentation is going to bounce between the engine and my PPT. So it's going to get a little technical, but in all aspects, it's not something that you haven't already done. So nothing to worry about. So I'm going to jump into Unreal here. This is 5.4, because 5.4.4, that's production ready right now. So I'm going to open up a map, the exact map that you just saw, but a CPU light mask baked version of it. And you can already see the issues that come with CPU light mask. Now, you can always say, there are ways to mitigate this that you get with your light mask settings that you get in world settings or any other kind of solution that you may come up with. But why has it look like this? Why is it looking like this? Because light baking generally asks for lower levels of surface area distribution so that you do not have to compensate with very large texel densities in your light maps, which is why large surface areas have been divided into single pieces like this. And this is a very common practice, but it comes with its side effects. These are mitigatable, either by art direction, where you create some sort of seam to hide these flaws. But there's only so much you can do if you have so many levels to go through, and you have to really put your mind to it and figure out or deviate from your actual art direction, right? And on the contrary, if you look at the exact map with GPU light bake, you don't really have to deal with anything like that, right? Because with GPU light mask, what happens is with every secondary bounce, you're not getting a separate thread per surface to deal with the shading. So that's why there's a uniformity with your bounce lighting and ambient occlusion collection. Now, let's throw a couple of things into the mix. We're going to try a movable actor into the scene. Now, I have a player start. This is a level with the third-person game mode already enabled. So you have a player start over here. So, and just to make it interesting, I have Android preview enabled. This project is not using Lumen, ray tracing, or any of the solutions that you could use on PC, right? This is purely meant for, excuse me, an Android output or anything limited like that, right? So if I play here, I have Quinn, and I have replaced Quinn's materials, and I'll explain why, to a completely metallic output. This is to understand how you can deal with specularity that you don't really get from volumetric light sample collections in a scene. Because if you look at the character, you are getting the directionality of the light and the overall diffuse effect of the lighting in the indirect section. And obviously, for the direct section, if this was a stationary sunlight, you would have gotten your direct sheen on the character as well. This is the worst case scenario. If this is static, what do you do, right? We'll be concentrating more on the indirect side of things. How do you deal with a scenario like this? How do you bring more life to a character's look using data from the scene? And that's where I'm going to go back to the presentation a little bit. Oh, by the way, if you are from the 4.xx era, you will know about Low-Shanks GPU light mask. Anyone in the audience who have heard about Low-Shanks? Would you raise your hand? Anyone? One, I see one. All right, so that does make it a little rare. It's not completely off the charts where you have to go to the depths of the internet to find this. This is from Unreal's forum. What Low-Shank used to provide users is an ability to leverage a DXR-capable hardware to get that GPU light baking that you get nowadays out of the box. Now, why am I talking about a bygone product like this? It's because with the integrated GPU light mask, you do have to push the settings a little bit to get a good bake. Low-Shank shines in that aspect where a default setting will still give you a similar kind of output. But it has its cons as well, given that you cannot use a UI system that comes with it. You have to use your command prompt to get the exact settings that you want, secondary bounce samples, tertiary bounce samples, irridance caching values, and all of that, right? So aside from the progress bar, you don't really see anything in the engine from Low-Shanks. So I'm going to go back to the engine and be talking about these three things which can drastically help sell your scene better and make it not only use the volumetric light samples that you get from baking, but also use scene data that we capture post-bake and use capsule indirect shadows. Now, again, I'm not sure if you've heard of these techniques. It's very commonplace, but the thing is, with the advent of Lumen and all, this is sort of bygone, right? So let's go back. Let's look at our character here. You don't see any indirect shadows. I mean, you do need ambient occlusion, and you can force that from the post-process volume. But if I approach the wall, she's not having a counter effect in the scene as much she's having an effect on herself. So I'm going to stop this sim. I'm going to go to our third-person folder, blueprint, character. And we'll be looking at the skeletal mesh, which is Quinn herself. And as you can see, I have some custom materials applied. This is just to take away any diffuse, non-specular surface from her body, right? But the more important thing here is we need to enable capsule indirect shadow over here. The moment you do that, if you play right now, you won't really get any effect, because capsule indirect shadow, as the name suggests, depends on your physics assets, capsule information, because that's the simplest form of her structure that can utilize whatever data you have in the scene as lighting and cast that information back into the scene. So, which means that you have to open up the skeletal mesh, and in the asset details panel, scroll all the way down, and you'll find this shadow physics asset slot. I don't think you can read text, so I'm reading them out for you. And this is in the asset details right below physics asset slot. And you can very well use your physics asset as is and slot it in there. But it's also not wrong to create your own duplication of the physics asset, which has a little more capsules to better integrate the shape of the body. Right now, for the sake of time, I'm going to use it as is. And you'll see the problem with it right away. So if I integrate that and save this asset, close it, save this as well, and get back into the scene, I do need to make sure. Give me 1 second. Oh, have I not done it for the right character? My bad. We can even check that out with a non-playable character as well. It doesn't really matter. It proceeds to any skeletal meshes. So if I do a mass search for Quinn Simple, which is the exact same character mesh that you use for your third-person template, and put her out there, and do the exact same thing. We'll open her up, make sure that she's using the physics asset, go outside, go to details panel, search for capsule, enable indirect shadow, and the engine decides to not work as intended. All right, so let's figure out why that's happening. I have a feeling that is to do with the physics asset. Let's have a look. Yeah, because I've plugged in the wrong physics asset. My bad. So anyways, so this is not far-fetched from what we're trying to demonstrate anyways. Let's keep the indirect shadows part aside. I think that should not be a problem as much as the other things can, which is the specularity side of things. I'm going to select the same actor. I'm going to look at your materials. I'm going to replace them with the materials that I have for demonstration. Give me 1 sec. We'll go to materials over here, and we have some character-based, complete metallic materials that take away all the diffuse aspect of your character. Give me 1 sec. There you go. Bring that here. Oh, my bad. So the reason why this is not working, quote unquote, is because of Android preview. Unfortunately, Capsule Indirect Shadow is not supported in mobile right now. This intends to be changed with the new updates that are coming with 5.5 in pipeline. So if I disable that, you're going to see. That's my bad. You can be a Unreal Authorized instructor for 10 years and still forget stuff like this. The evidence of that, right? So you might, though, still notice that there is contact shadow missing on the ground. And that is not because she's not flush to the ground. And that is only because if you look at her physics asset, if you remember what the word is, it's capsule indirect shadow. These are not capsules. And that is where I go back and say, you don't have to use the exact physics asset that you use for physics or any kind of collision. You can create a different one just for lighting, right? I'm not going to do that because it takes a lot of time. And the moment you do that, it'll ground your actor to the scene. All right, so how do we deal with specularity here? I'm going to open up the material, and you're going to be able to notice there is something which is, let's just at least from my end, be named spec blend over here, okay, for the sake of simplicity. It's been set to 0, and there is also another slot for cube map. So this is a pre-recorded cube map from the scene. You can do that using your scene capture actor, your scene capture cube actor. That'll give you a cube map of the scene, and you shouldn't be keeping it live. You make a static asset out of it, give you a texture like this. And what it allows you to do is set up your materials in a way that it utilizes as many captured data like this, and you can blend between them if you move from scene to scene, and give you an output like this. Now, if I enable it and force it to the maximum, it's going to look a bit funny, like she's made of some kind of tin, aluminum mixture, not really steel or anything that we were going for. That's because it's pushed to the max. And not only that, we're also seeing a lot of issue with occlusion on the other end, where we're getting reflections where we don't want. How do we deal with that? First of all, I'm going to bring this down to a relatively good amount. We still get the sheen. So this is completely without. And this is with the mix. And now I'll show you another solution that can cut off the areas which you don't want. And that's the occlusion. So without occlusion, with occlusion. It's subtle, but if you go to the other side, and I'm going to rotate this just to show you that it is interactive, right? So the other side of her body is completely negating reflections that you don't want. So what's happening here? I'm going to take a quick look at the material setup, and it's pretty simple. It's using reflection vector as a node that allows you to project your cube map as reflections on your surface. I'm sure you're pretty familiar with that. I'm blending that along with a atmosphere light vector node that gives you data from which direction the sunlight is coming from. I'm using that along with your vertex normal dot product output and clamping that into a lerp. That lerp is serving as a mask to let the material know which side am I supposed to use the diffuse information from the rest of the material setup, which is pretty simple here, and which side am I supposed to infuse the specularity. And that specularity modification that we made goes into the emissive node, which is funny because ideally, these kind of information you generally put into the base color. You must be wondering why. That's because light reflected from a surface is still light, so it has to emit, right? As long as you don't push it to the limits, it'll look fine. So that's the setup here. It's pretty simple. It does the job. Along with that, if you had a slightly beneficial scenario where the sunlight here would have been stationary, you would have gotten direct lighting on her from the sunlight as you're getting specular information in the indirect lighting. So solutions can be utilized like this. I'm going to go back to the presentation. And as you see, these are things we talked about from the Unreal, from the project, sorry. So again, easy demonstration of those exact things, simplified version of that in this section. I don't know still if you could read. I mean, I have to do the most of the talking here, right? So there are multiple ways in which you can utilize it, not just for light and light occlusion, as you can see below, heat mapping and stuff like that as well, right? Let's move on to vertex AO baking. How many of you have heard this term or utilized it in your games? I see Farzan raising his hand. You can go full Farzan, right? So anyways, vertex AO baking is basically giving you the same utility as Lightbake without hindering you as Lightbake does. Because Lightbake is going to attach build data with your game and your levels, right? And it's not something that you can dynamically manipulate as much as you would want to. Vertex AO baking, on the other hand, bakes vertex color data into your mesh. So the mesh heft that you're carrying in your scene remains the same. Ideally, you just have to increase the mesh density a little bit, which any decent CPU nowadays is able to handle. And this is ideally a solution that you would use for your hero characters, right? So there are pros and cons to everything. It absolutely has no dependency on light mask baking unless you want to expand it to everything in the scene. It has less dependency on contact shadow use case from your whatever lights you have. It is accurate because it's pre-computed, and you don't need mesh distance field for it, which means it's scalable all the way down to mobiles, right? Cons, not dynamic. It does not manipulate itself based on the scene's lighting data. Not to say that it's not something that you can manipulate on your own in the material, which I'm going to show. And it's not really good for iterative workflow, just like Lightbake isn't, because you kind of have to bake this again and again if you make changes to your mesh, not to your scene. And it had the last and the most important downside of this is it has a direct dependency on the vertex count of your mesh. So you want to limit this to your, I would say, hero assets only, right? So this is vertex AO baking within the engine. I'm going to go back into Unreal and demonstrate a map where the use case is more open world and practical, right? So let's filter for levels. Do I have a level filter over here? Yes. Do I want to save? Why not? Right? Vehicle map. All right. Open world scenario. I have more or less shut off the entirety of ambient occlusion from the post-process volume. All right? We might need it, might not need it. But the main concern here is with the hero assets. 2 cars, again, extremely specular materials applied just so that we can discuss. We are trying to discuss. It's not really to do with reality. You don't really get fully metallic cars. Don't quote me on it. So we have 2 cars over here. One materialized the traditional way, semi-metallic to metallic surface, and a traditional glass material. It's going to hover around it so you can see how it's reacting to the scene. And the other one, it's not traditional at all. It's using a material that mimics the look of the other one, and not only being independent of the things that the other one is dependent on, but it's actually cheaper, right? It has its own downsides, I'll explain it. But if you look at the glass, it's able to get information and look much sharper and pristine, right? It's pushed to a limit as well so as to get as much reflections as possible. But if you compare it to the other one, it's bare minimum. You can push a traditional glass shader to its limit as well, but you're going to run into a bottleneck where your shader gets too complicated, right? So what constitutes reflection and good ambient occlusion in a scene? Either your baked data, but let's remove that because this is an open world scenario, right? How do you get reflections in an open world scenario? Either reflection capture actors, which you can't really distribute 1 million of them, or your overarching reflection providing actor, which is skylight. So let's cut this off right at the feet. I'm going to take the skylight and completely disable it. Now out goes reflection through the window. You don't really see anything on this car anymore because it's completely dependent on the reflection capture actors in the scene. You can actually bring things back, but then you'll have to utilize other actors to do the same job as the skylight was doing. But if I go to the other one, it seems to be independent. It's not using anything different from what I showed you before, just utilizing it in a more interesting fashion, because if I open the material up, you're going to notice one extra trick that I've utilized. If you look at the cube map here, the cube map is a little blurred. You can utilize blur maps, or you can blur it yourself and bring it back. Just make sure there's no seam. You must be wondering, why did I do that? It's because if you have any surface that is not absolutely polished to the nth order, it's not going to reflect anything like a mirror, right? So you need a cube map which is sort of looking like this. That's the trick here, right? That's not to say it works. But the other thing is, you have all the other functionalities like the one you saw before with the character. Along with that, there is something else as well, which is the glass. It's sort of using the same trick. If I open up the glass here, the only difference is it's not really a translucent shader. It is using the depth buffer from your scene. So it is more or less the same cost, but it's not, in order to make it look that good, I didn't have to push it that far. So first of all, it's additive, and it's unlit. Again, why unlit? Because you just need the emissive information, because you're going to bounce light off of this, right? So again, it's using the reflection vector plugged into an HDRI. You can use the HDRI of your choice, capture it from the scene, manipulate this, lerp this, and I'm going to show you an example of lerping HDRIs to make sure your scene data or your material data doesn't get outdated. And then plug that in, and there are some other tricks with Fresnel. You must work with Fresnel to make things look realistic, right? Couple all of that together, and your actor's look becomes completely scene independent. That's not to say don't detach it from reality altogether, but it gets the job done. I'm going to bring the skylight back. Sorry, that wasn't the way I shut it. Give me a second. Yeah, there you go. I'm going to bring the skylight back, and I'll go to the other car. And I've kept everything metallic for a reason. You're getting directional occlusion from the direct light in the scene, so you get darkened areas, but this isn't your true ambient occlusion in an indirect section of your car, in this case, the car, right? Because if I look straight down into the scene, why am I seeing the sky? There are ways to negate this as well. You can use bent normals in your scene. But that's, again, something that you have to generate. I'm going to be talking about that as well in a sec. I do not have much time. But coming to the point, if I go to the other car, it's sort of facing the same issue right now, sort of worse because it's not entirely dependent on the skylight, as I mentioned before. But if I look into the material, I have one option here called Enable Vertex Ambient Occlusion. This is, again, independent of ambient occlusion that is either screen space or pre-compute generation within this scene. So it's not like it's going to get outdated. It's a general ambient occlusion that a car would have. So if I enable that, there you go. I mean, you would prefer the car not looking like it's lit in I don't know, universal lighting coming from God knows where, right? So it has to be occluded. Compare that to the other one, you can clearly see the difference, right? So, and it has other features just like the occlusion, light occlusion, and stuff like that. And this is not restricted to the interior. You get very interesting details where you wouldn't otherwise get. Like the details start from a crevice that is extremely small to a very large occluded section, like the interior of the car. I'm going to just disable, enable to show the difference. I'll go back to the presentation. This is just a showcase of the same tech, but done within the engine. You can vertex AO bake within the engine. You just have to make sure your mesh has enough density where it needs to be. So that's not going to be saved as ambient occlusion texture. That is being saved directly into the mesh. And you can leverage that data into your material. So it's pretty cheap. For the car in this scenario, I've used an external solution like 3ds Max. You don't really need to see this. This is anything a DCC can do nowadays, which goes to say that you get the same solution in Blender as well, just with a little bit of Blender market help, right? And bring that back into Unreal if you want. Another part of my talk is distance field. I'm going to keep this short. Again, distance field is not something that you can directly use in mobile, but at least mesh distance field is out of the box enabled inside Unreal Engine 5, and it's much more accurate and faster than Unreal Engine 4. And you can leverage that and have soft penumbras from your lights, because the way we got soft ambient occlusion and indirect lighting with our character earlier was because it was a skeletal mesh. Now you must be wondering, what about static meshes? And that's your solution. And this is me just showing the exact same thing. You have a point light which isn't utilizing distance field to begin with. Mesh distance field is already enabled in the scene. And now if I increase source angle, you're going to see some soft shadow in the penumbra section of the light, right? Some dependencies to remember. You have to make sure mesh distance field is enabled. And if for any reason your mesh needs more information than what it comes with in terms of generated mesh distance field, you have to go into the mesh settings and enable or increase the distance field resolution scale. That's about it. Other than that, you have, what have you, your generic texture baking tools, which otherwise you would have to go to a texture baking suite to help with. Now it's all available within the engine. Ideally, I would show you all of this inside Unreal, but I don't really have time anymore. You can explore them yourself. There's AO baking that you can bake and bring or keep that as an AO texture that you can manipulate in order to occlude shadows, or occlude reflections where you don't want, or use it as AO as is, right? The final demonstration to bring this into perspective, all of the things that we talked about. So that's cube map blending in order to get different lighting scenario. This is not using Lumen, just to repeat, right? This is a scenario where the client needed a scene. Yes, albeit the car is static, but everything else had to be dynamic. So it's utilizing all of the things that we talked about: vertex AO baking, mesh distance field, indirect shadows, fake reflections into the material in order to not depend on any kind of dynamic reflection solutions, and lerping between cube maps to leverage the maximum output in a scalable environment, right? Another use case is to have that sort of look along with some climate dynamics. Like this is going from your typical generic Icelandic look. And by the way, this had to run on a mobile, right? So you're getting this sort of look. This is using all Quixel assets, not the background though. One trick we used here, we did not use particle to interact with ground collision, because that would just cost too much on the particle side of things. We combined all of the meshes, decimated down to 10,000, made it a masked surface so you don't see anything visible other than the splashes. The splashes are camera facing, and they just spawn on random areas, and they're always facing the cam. So it's an easy solution. It gives you the illusion of rain splattering on the ground, where it's actually not. The rain just goes through and dies after a feet. And finally, one last example with all of these solutions coming together with snow. They wanted a quick time lapse of what it looks to go between a generic overcast environment to a snowed-in environment. It's using all of those techniques, albeit I could have done better with the cube map on the glass, because it looks like it's not overcast there. So in retrospect, I could have done better. So yeah, those are some of the stuff. And if you're looking forward to more things that can help you with limited hardware, mobile being one of them, these are the things to look forward to in 5.5 when it comes out. It's already out. You can use the alpha. And I know no one can remember such a long URL, but I just plugged it in there if you wanted to give 5.5 a whirl, which is available right now, as you know. So yeah, that's about it. I hope this was useful. This talks a lot about things which were in use practically in pretty much every AAA back in the day, but it's sort of forgotten nowadays. So yeah, thank you.